In the matter of State of Minnesota versus Kimberly Potter, court file number 27CR217490, we, the jury, on the charge of manslaughter in the first degree while committing a misdemeanor on or about April 11, 2021, in Hennepin County, State of Minnesota, find the defendant guilty. And the verdict was agreed to at the hour of 11:40 a.m. and signed by the jury person on 12/23/21. The verdict on count 2 is we, the jury, on the charge of manslaughter in the second degree, culpable negligence on or about April 11, 2021, in Hennepin County, State of Minnesota, find the defendant guilty.
Greetings and salutations, loyal viewers. Today we are going to be discussing my glasses. Oh wait, no, we're not talking about my glasses. What we're actually going to be talking about is the conviction on first and second degree manslaughter of one Kimberly Potter in the shooting death of one Daunte Wright, and how I think this, among many of the other cases that have risen to prominence in recent years, is probably going to be the most negatively impactful for our nation. But before we get into the unhealthy consequences of what we're talking about, before we keto with justice transition, if you're trying to stick to your fitness New Year's resolutions, you might want to introduce a keto powder in order to speed up your results. A good keto supplement will actually keep you in a prolonged fat burning state known as ketosis for as long as possible, and the keto powder that I recommend right here on this channel is Keto with Justice. This ultra rich powder helps deliver clean energy, mental focus, and weight management throughout your body. This keto powder uses a powerhouse of ingredients to support elevated ketone levels and all the confidence boosting benefits that come with it. There's a reason this weight management supplement has become the favorite of many who have tried it. Now, I partnered with the creators of this amazing keto powder in order to get you guys a 51% discount in order to celebrate the new year. Just go to ketowithjustice.com or click the link in the pinned comment or the top of the description and order yours today. So long-term viewers of this channel will remember that I actually did videos at the time about the shooting of Daunte Wright in Minneapolis. I believe this was done by the Brooklyn Center Police Department. Well, the trial has occurred, and Kimberly Potter, the officer behind that shooting, was convicted of first and second degree manslaughter for her role in the death of one Daunte Wright. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the way things went down, let's dispel the myth of Daunte Wright first and foremost, so you guys can understand what actually happened. Now, the way that the myth goes is that Daunte Wright was an innocent young man just on his way to wash his car when all of a sudden evil white racist cops from the Brooklyn Center Minneapolis Police Department, or whatever they're actually called, pulled him over due to racism, and they used him having an air freshener hanging from his mirror as the excuse to pull him over. And then, for no reason, they tried to capture this innocent young black man who is innocent, young, and black, and a man, and arrest him when all of a sudden Kimberly Potter, out of racism, pulled out her gun and shot one Daunte Wright for no reason. Now, of course, this is not what happened at all. Of course, this is a ridiculous oversimplification based on an early narrative, yet you still see it perpetuated throughout the media because people who are behind these kind of narratives have an agenda, and that agenda is to make people seem innocent who are actually guilty and make you think cops are evil white racists who are both evil white and racist, and cops and evil and racist. But in reality, what actually happened in the Kimberly Potter case is that Daunte Wright was pulled over for expired registration tags. This is a legitimate reason to pull somebody over. He also committed an illegal turn without signaling, and on top of that, he did have an air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror. He was not pulled over specifically for the air freshener. That is nonsensical. That was not what was testified to. It was compounding factors. During the course of Daunte Wright being pulled over, it was discovered that Daunte Wright had an open warrant because he missed a court date on a felony assault and robbery, where Daunte, our innocent angel of a man, decided it would be a good idea to go into a woman's apartment, point a gun at her, choke her, and then take her rent money, which was $820. Now, you might think $820 is not so bad, but again, if you're somebody who's living in Minnesota and you don't have a lot of money, and this man just comes in, points a gun at you with his friend, chokes you, and takes your money, that might be a big deal to you. And if you're somebody like Daunte Wright and you are arrested on this felony, it might behoove you to go and actually show up to court and face the consequences of your actions. But Daunte Wright is never one to face the actual consequences of his actions. So what he ended up doing was resisting arrest when they informed him that he had a warrant for skipping court on the felony charges that he occurred because he's a criminal. Now, as you can see on the video, Daunte Wright is clearly being warned by the officer not to resist arrest. Daunte ignores this, breaks free from the officer, jumps in the vehicle. Now, what you can't see on the video is that there's actually another officer on the other side of this that is reaching through the passenger side window with an attempt to shift the car into park, essentially grounding Daunte Wright where he is and preventing this situation from escalating. Now, this all came into play in the trial, as we'll discuss a little bit later on, but this is probably around the fateful moment where Kimberly Potter, the officer of 26 years, inadvertently drew her gun instead of her taser and pointed it at Daunte Wright. Then Wright gets ready to take off. Kimberly Potter fires one shot and immediately reacts negatively after realizing the horrific mistake that she actually made. Now, the thing that bothered me about this case at the time, and it still bothers me to this day, is the people that assert that Kimberly Potter either intentionally drew her gun for no reason in order to kill Daunte Wright, and in the moment, in her infinite evil, decided to shout taser, 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 for cover, and then fired, and then immediately had an emotional reaction, all as a part of a plan that she concocted to kill this man for no reason at all whatsoever. Or the people who say, well, a taser technically weighs a different amount than a gun, and they look completely different. And because when I'm looking at an image of the two side by side, can tell the difference between a gun and a taser, therefore, officers never ever accidentally reach for one instead of the other. This is obviously ridiculous. We've gone over this multiple different times, but the idea that you in a calm state can distinguish between two things, therefore mistakes never happen in the heat of the moment, is absurd in every single possible way, and this honestly wasn't even really contested by the prosecution in this case. Now, people will also assert that the gun and the taser are put on opposite sides of the belt in order to prevent mistakes in drawing one for the other. Now, what they don't realize is that when they state this, is that implicitly in that statement, this acknowledges that there's some level of confusion that does happen in heat of the moment situations where officers were grabbing their gun instead of their taser or their taser instead of their gun, and that led to negative results. This is why they're positioned on opposite sides of the belt in order to mitigate that possibility, meaning that the Minneapolis Police Department, this department in question, and many others with similar protocols like this, acknowledge that this could happen and it's likely to happen, so they've taken a precaution to mitigate the possibility of it in fact happening, which does not support the position that Kimberly Potter did it on purpose. It actually supports my position. So we're not entertaining the idea that Kimberly Potter for no reason intended to murder Daunte Wright. we're not entertaining the idea that Kimberly Potter did something that was anything but accidental in this scenario, because I'm not going to suggest that she had some motive to kill this guy, because that's absurd. And I'm also not going to entertain the suggestion that Kimberly Potter is the greatest actress in the world, and all of her instant reactions and her yelling out taser were her calling out an alibi to the future just in case she got charged for this murder that she desperately wanted to commit for no reason in this moment. So we got that. We're all clear. We all understand that. So based on the absolute certainty, the acknowledgement of reality that this was in fact nothing more than an accidental shooting of Daunte Wright, we have to go based on that and determine whether or not the charges were fitting, and determine whether or not the convictions against Kimberly Potter for those charges are in fact legitimate. And I want to bring you to the first degree manslaughter charge that Kimberly Potter was in fact convicted of at trial, because I think this will be very instructive of whether or not she was guilty of the crime as charged. And if you go to the first degree manslaughter statute, you'll see that we're running into some problems with 85% of this statute. Now, the first thing that we need to do when we look at this statute and we analyze whether or not Kimberly Potter could be found guilty of this is to go over the intentionality portion and just cross that right out. We just established in this video that this was an accidental shooting. Any arguments to the contrary of this shooting being accidental are ideologically motivated and stupidly motivated, because there's no way in hell that this was anything but accidental. So then we move on to the other portions of the statute, and when we're talking about the child abuse portions of it, I would hope, I would pray that you guys are at the level of understanding that you would get that this is not a child abuse scenario. So now that we've got that all established, hopefully we're all on the same page when it comes to this. I'm hoping we can also cross out the part where it says you're guilty of first degree manslaughter if you illegally sell somebody drugs and that leads to somebody's death. Again, hopefully we can all get on the same level. I know some of you are furiously typing in the comments that you know the difference between the weight of a taser and the weight of a gun. We all understand that. You're not special. You're not impressing anybody with your lack of intellect or your lack of ability to analyze a situation. We're just crossing off portions of the statute that are absolutely ridiculous, and hopefully you should be able to acknowledge that you're not going to be able to prove intentionality, or that she was selling drugs, or that she was abusing a child beyond a reasonable doubt. So what this really comes down to is this section right here, which talks about you committing something that allowed somebody to die during the course of your commission of this crime. Now we click the link of this crime to figure out what exactly it is. And it turns out section 609.224 is assault in the fifth degree. So the reason this section of the statute is important, and all of this case rests on this misdemeanor assault charge, is the state of Minnesota is essentially arguing that Kimberly Potter committed an assault against Daunte Wright, and he died as a result of the assault that she committed. So we go to the statute and we discover that this fifth degree misdemeanor assault has two components that could result in the conviction of Potter. Thus, because Daunte Wright died, would equal a first degree manslaughter charge. And I'm going to read them to you so that you guys can understand why I have such trouble with this conviction. The first section is as follows. Whoever does any of the following commits an assault and is guilty of a misdemeanor. 1. Commits an act with intent to cause fear in another of immediate bodily harm or death, or intentionally inflicts or attempts to inflict bodily harm upon another. Now, there is a specific portion of this statute later on that talks about a firearm, and I'm going to immediately concede the fact that Kimberly Potter does in fact meet that, because that part of the statute says the court needs to determine whether or not the person owns a firearm or used a firearm. Obviously, what this all rests on is whether or not Potter intentionally tried to intimidate or inflict fear of bodily harm or death on Daunte Wright. Now, to me, this is just not the case. The first thing we establish, beyond any shadow of a doubt, unless, again, you're an insane leftist who just wants to go after the cops because you don't like police officers, is that this was an accidental shooting. So there's no way she intentionally assaulted him in the course of the accidental shooting. And basically what the prosecution tried to argue is that even tasing Daunte Wright in that scenario was against Minnesota police procedure, which, by the way, I looked into it. It's kind of vague. It's essentially the argument that when you tase somebody or you try to act upon somebody behind the wheel of a car, you could potentially commit more damage by doing so, which some departments have those regulations, some don't. But Minnesota's regulations specifically for this department don't appear to be A, legally binding, their regulations and police procedure, and B, they don't appear to be as strict as an absolute do not shoot, do not fire upon somebody in a moving vehicle, because that can cause danger. So to me, that's totally irrelevant when we're talking about this. What this comes down to is whether or not, and it was testified in court for the defense, Kimberly Potter was justified in using either the taser or deadly force in this scenario. And basically the way this was laid out to me is this guy is fleeing on a felony warrant. He's driving away. He has the officer's hands in the vehicle. The officer could be dragged by the vehicle. So deadly force intentionally would have been appropriate in this scenario, according to some people that I've heard talk about this. However, without any shadow of a doubt, she did not intentionally try to assault Daunte Wright. That's just not the case. So for them to add an intentional misdemeanor assault charge, which, by the way, the prosecution wasn't even going to charge originally, the family demanded this to be charged, and for that to be convictable by a jury, to me is absolutely absurd and could have a long-term damaging effects for policing in this nation in the future. Now, to be clear, despite Daunte Wright's actions, despite Daunte Wright's criminal history, despite all of that, Daunte Wright should not have died during the course of this police stop. This is acknowledged by every party, including Kimberly Potter. So the idea that I'm advocating or justifying his death is absolutely absurd. What I am saying is that when you have an accidental scenario during the course of regular duties as a police officer, this becomes a civil matter, not a criminal matter. And if it is a criminal matter, you can't charge intent when everybody is basically conceding that she drew her gun by accident and intended to tase him, not intended to shoot him. So for me, this conviction is very bad for our nation and very bad for policing going forward, especially in the state of Minnesota. If you're a police officer in Minnesota, this conviction on charges that clearly do not fit essentially means that the state attorney general, Keith Ellison, who's a radical leftist, will hang you out to dry even when there's not a legitimate case against you. A lot of people talked about the effect of Derek Chauvin being convicted, but remember how we discussed the Derek Chauvin case on this channel throughout the course of it. We always talked about how if Derek Chauvin were to get off, it would be an instance of reasonable doubt, not an instance of him being able to prove his innocence in a court of law. So that really doesn't set the precedent, especially because the video is so bad and a lot of people would have had like the consciousness in that moment to remove their knee from the suspect, especially when the crowd is getting agitated and especially when there's a camera in your face. So I never bought the idea that Chauvin's conviction would somehow send a message that scares police officers when they're going about their day-to-day duties and thus preventing them from doing so. However, this case is one of those cases that will scare off officers because although her superior officer refused to fire her and ended up resigning in protest over people trying to hang her out to dry, hanging her out to dry did in fact work and she was convicted on the high count, possibly due to the fact that juries in this area are so sick and afraid of rioting that they're just convicting on whatever charges they're presenting against officers. That should be very concerning, not just to police officers in the state of Minnesota or police officers across this country whenever there's a leftist district attorney or attorney general, but to all of us as citizens, because when officers pull back, crime emerges, and we've seen that in Minnesota specifically. Now, in my opinion, the second-degree manslaughter also does not fit in this case. If you look up the statute, again, they will all be linked in the description so you can look them over. The portion of the statute that would apply to Kimberly Potter's actions, or you could argue would apply to Kimberly Potter's actions, is section 1, and it reads as follows. A person who causes the death of another by any of the following means is guilty of manslaughter in the second degree and may be sentenced to imprisonment for not more than 10 years or to the payment of a fine not more than $20,000 or both, by the person's culpable negligence, whereby the person creates unreasonable risk and consciously takes chances of causing death or great bodily harm to another. Now, the other sections involve shooting somebody that you mistake for a deer on a hunt or neglect of a child, so obviously the section in question that the jury must have convicted on would be this specific section. And I just don't believe that when you accidentally draw the gun, which does create the risk, and you could say that risk was to negligence, that you are culpable by consciously ignoring that risk when you don't realize you have the gun in the hand. So again, this conviction on this charge does not make sense. And if you want a good breakdown of the difference between negligence, that is basically something that you can get a civil judgment against the person or entity for, and negligence that becomes criminal, Nate the lawyer has a video specifically on this where he breaks it down. The entire video will be linked in the description. But overall, just reading the statute, you can't consciously ignore a risk that you're not aware of, so I don't think she could have been convicted of second-degree manslaughter. So we have two charges that didn't really fit the circumstances that she was convicted on of both of them. And on top of that, they're pushing for a stricter sentence against Potter. The average sentence that you would get for a first-time offender for the high charge that she got was about 8.5 years. But the prosecution is pushing more towards the maximum, which is closer to 15 years, because they really want to make this woman fry. And honestly, other than anti-cop sentiment, other than far leftist ideology basically being pervasive and dominant in the Minnesota Attorney General's office, there is no justification for that. You're not sending a message to officers that they need to be cautious when they're committing crimes, when everybody should acknowledge that this was an accidental shooting. Punishing an accident with aggravating circumstances as if it was due to some kind of evil, bad intent does not really bring a resolution to this scenario. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you like the video, you can show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. You can follow me on all my social medias. You can support me via the support links in the description box. This has been me talking about the conviction of one Kimberly Potter. Till next time.